Idle No More merged in 2012 as an Aboriginal grassroots movement in Saskatchewan, which focused on the education and revitalization of Indigenous people through awareness and empowerment and the promotion of knowledge sharing about the indigenous sovereignty and environmental protections. Our presentation will look at the intersections of three-board and intersecting themes within the Idle No More movement, along with its effectiveness in spreading its message to the public. First, we will speak to the role played by gender and feminism in Idle No More movement in relation both to the power of social media and its relevance to adult education. Then we will proceed to examine the environmental concerns of the Idle No More movement, focusing on three main effects of Bill C-45 on the Aboriginal environment. Finally, we will look at the limitations of social media as a means of mobilizing support while considering the unique characteristics of modern technology, business practices, and government policy.
The issue of gender is at the core of Idle No More as a movement, as resistance, and as a space of empowerment. The movement itself was started by 4 women in Saskatchewan, 3 of which are Aboriginal. Jessica Gordon, Sylvia McAdam, Sheila McLean, and Nina Wilson, fed up and frustrated by the lack of care among the Canadian government towards environmental issues and Aboriginal peoples, took it among themselves to stand up in the name of Indigenous sovereignty, environmental protection, and feminist activism. First Nations women have a long history of leadership in traditional communities as caretakers of environments and in developing resistance movements. In regards to Idle No More, all of these roles were fulfilled due to their utilization of social media as a platform for mass mobilization. According to FACHI 2014, there exists 4 typologies of gender embedded within the movement. It is through the lens of these categories that our investigation of gender, social media, and Idle No More will be carried out. The first, warrior women, relates to the role of Indigenous women as strong and independent and is evident across many of the social media platforms utilized by the group. For example, comments such as, quote, "A true warrior woman, we need more like you," unquote, and, quote, "Stay stronger than ever, warrior woman, you're amazing and everyone supports you," unquote, were found on social media platforms and indicate support for the strong female leadership and agency embodied by Indigenous women. This support, however, is not limited to women, as throughout our research of social media platforms pertinent to the movement, such as Facebook and Twitter, there were many positive comments posted by men. This first typology of warrior women serves to empower both Indigenous and non-Indigenous females, and it is this kind of empowerment that is crucial to social engagement learning and learning by participation and activism. Amongst the analysis of social media discourse, it became clear that despite these women being symbols of strength and power, the organizers intentionally did not make Idle No More about themselves. Instead, Idle No More was about empowering Indigenous people to determine their own futures, rediscover their voices, and to be made feel as if they could make a difference. The second gendered aspect of the movement, as highlighted by FACHI, involves ending violence against women. This aspect is connected to patriarchal understandings of gender and colonial violence. According to the Idle No More website, their 6th call for change is to actively resist violence against women, and after investigating a series of blogs, it became clear that the fact that Indigenous women have been at the forefront of Idle No More as a movement to affirm Indigenous nationhood, personal sovereignty, to end sexual violence, and to mobilize feminist rights. This likely results from them being the most impacted by the interlinked systems of colonialism, environmental degradation, inequality, and poverty in Canadian society. This transitions nicely into FACHI's next typology, Native and Indigenous feminisms. Social media provides a distinct insight into this aspect of Idle No More, as it enables us to explore whether or not the movement is a feminist movement. It was concluded that while Idle No More itself did not come to exist as a feminist movement, the connections between feminism and decolonization are critical to the movement. Although Idle No More was initiated by Bill C-45 and calls for Indigenous sovereignty as a whole, the organizers made the voices and concerns of Indigenous women in particular central to its platform and the protests. Some scholarly literature argues that the movement is inherently feministic, as the leadership and strength portrayed by the women within the movement was a revolutionary challenge to the status quo of colonized gender constructions. Thus, while the motivations behind the movement may not have been entirely feminist, the mode of resistance and collectivization certainly was. Moreover, although there are hundreds of men who wrote posts and supported the movement during its peak years, the majority of the participants and organizers are women. Thus, the engagement itself is gendered in a feminist manner, as the bulk of social media mobilization we found was initiated by women. Social media provided First Nations women with a larger and broader platform from which to act. The last gendered aspect Facci addresses is the idea of and reference to Mother Earth. This speaks to the role of Indigenous women in their communities as life-givers and caretakers, both of the people and of the lands. Graveline argues that Aboriginal women are born into gender roles rooted in spiritual duties and daily responsibilities to care for and nurture the waters, the land, and the womb of their, quote, Earth Mother, unquote. References to Mother Earth littered both the Twitter and Facebook feeds utilized by the movement. To be exact, the term Mother Earth was used over 2,800 times between November 2012 and the end of April 2013 on just the Facebook page. This emphasizes the closely linked relationship of women and the environment within Indigenous communities and points to an inherent bond between women and their Earth Mother. The intrinsic connection between Indigenous female leaders and environmentalism became more widely disseminated and apparent because of Idle No More. By making their voices heard, social media allowed women to reclaim traditional gender roles while simultaneously empowering and including other genders and future generations. As argued by Coates, social media mattered a great deal to Idle No More, due to the fact that it freed the movement from reliance on traditional media sources. The utilization of technology itself became a method of decolonization, ensuring that the ideas and messages were shared as the organizers and participants intended. In conclusion, social media provided a space that allowed Aboriginal peoples to collect in spite of their wide geographic span. It also incorporated and sought out the opinions of those who are usually not welcomed into the discussion, Indigenous women. Yet, at the same time, it promoted inclusion and fostered alliances no matter what religion, culture, race, age, or gender. And although the peak of the movement has passed, the reach of Idle No More participants continues to expand as information that had previously been restricted to Aboriginal communities has now reached thousands of people across the globe. This section of our research has aimed to demonstrate the ideologies of gender within the movement and how these have been revealed through an analysis and utilization of social media. Thus, gender and social media exist as central components to the Idle No More movement, often engaging with each other in mutually reciprocal ways. With specific respect to adult education, the use of social media within the Idle No More movement helps highlight the differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge paradigms. This may further allow people to see the value in understanding these nuances and the ways in which the two can be combined as complementary. There is much to be learned from Idle No More in regards to gender. Surely, the movement provides insights into Aboriginal values, epistemologies, ontologies, and knowledges, but it also sheds a bright light on the significance of social engagement learning and the subsequent sense of identity and empowerment that often results from engaging in these kinds of participatory actions.
One of the major motives of protest for Idle No More was the removal of acts previously in place to protect the environment and the land that traditionally belongs to the Indigenous people of Canada. Going far back as when the French first landed in Nova Scotia, there has been a continuous dispute over the use of Canadian land and natural resources between the Indigenous population and the Government of Canada. Frustrated with the legislation proposed by the Harper government, through Idle No More, the Aboriginal population in Canada were determined to gain control over their land and sovereignty over their people. The implementation of Bill C-45 drastically impacted environmental protection laws over traditional indigenous land by bringing forth changes to the Indian Act, Canadian Environmental Assessments Act, and the Navigable Waters Act. Bill C-45 was one of the most recent pieces of legislation to amend the Indian Act, impacting sovereignty and treaty rights. Originally, the Indian Act required a large majority of the band members to vote in favor of leasing reserve land to the federal government or a corporation. Bill C-45 reduced the number of band members needed or required to yield this reserve land. As a result, treaty rights are being violated by Bill C-45 because the reserve lands were set aside for the exclusive use and benefit of band members only. So the concept of surrendering those lands conditionally or unconditionally is something that takes away from the collective use and benefit, especially if the integrity is not being maintained. At a minimum, it requires the consent of First Nations to agree to this legislative change, and that's a legal requirement by the Supreme Court of Canada. Many leaders of Idle No More argue that forfeiting of this land is detrimental to the future generations of Indigenous people in Canada. The Environmental Assessments Act was passed in 1992, which assured that the federal government had to take into consideration the effect on the environment before putting in motion major projects. Additionally, it required the approval of departments such as the Environment Canada to conduct environmental assessments on all proposed projects. Bill C-45 removed these requirements for environmental review for all minor projects, leading to a reduction in Aboriginal involvement. Additionally, through the Environmental Assessments Act, projects with large-scale impacts on the environment could take up to 6 years to gain approval, whereas Bill C-45 brought forth changes that saw these large-scale projects being approved within 6 months. The Navigable Waters Act, through Bill C-45, the government intended to diminish protection of Canada's navigable waters. Previously, what was known as the Navigable Water Protection Act states that approval will be needed for any major or minor projects that may affect navigable waters of Canada. Bill C-45 renames this act to the Navigable Protection Act, or the Navigation Protection Act, reducing federal environmental protection, leading to a decreased number of bodies of water being protected from harm. It is estimated Canada has 32,000 major lakes and 2.25 million rivers. Through Bill C-65, the protection is now reduced to only 97 lakes, 3 oceans, and 62 rivers, which left many waterways vulnerable to highly contagious pipelines and tar and sand oils.
In this section, I will discuss the limitations of social media on the movement of Idle No More and cover how social media is not an entirely sufficient means to educate Canadians on the challenges of Indigenous peoples in Canada. As argued by Mozorov, the internet is not inherently democratizing, and to embrace cyber-utopianism is wrong. While social media websites are available for everyone to use at no cost, their use still requires a level of technological know-how and access. So if people don't know how to use the internet or the social media websites, or simply don't have access to them, they are unable to be involved in such movements. Technological literacy is central to one's engagement with online social media platforms. Also, according to Jennifer Curlis's article, dominant businesses profit from advertising on social media websites, and these websites are under heavy surveillance. Therefore, while the dominant business's advertising would be readily available for users, activities and events from movements such as It'll No More, which will not generate any kind of profit to these websites, may remain very small and as a result will not reach a larger audience. Therefore, it cannot be that effective. The internet or social media platforms are not exempt from the perpetuation of power relations. Advertising is inseparable from the space for users to connect via social media, and detailed profiles allow companies to focus target marketing strategies specific to individual users, at least much more specific than traditional one-to-many television advertising. Frankfurt theorist Marcuse in 1964 wrote about the impact of technology on society and believed that through media and educational discourses, those with power in society perpetuate false needs that tie the middle and working class to consumer society. Therefore, there are so much advertising on social media websites. Particularly recently, when an internet user searches for an item on Google or other search engines online, other items like that item that was searched for are advertised on that user's social media websites like Facebook or Instagram. Many people might just click on that item without thinking when they are being somewhat imposed on them because of their past searches. Excessive advertising on social media sites such as YouTube, Facebook, or Instagram occupies individuals' minds and encourages them towards consumer behavior. Consequently, that leaves no room for critical thinking or questioning the dominant ideologies. As discussed, using social media websites is only attainable to those who have access and the computer literacy to utilize these platforms. The participation gap is stratified by social class, race, gender, ability, and other intersecting factors. Therefore, the participation in social media websites, as well as the movements on Indigenous peoples of Canada, may not be very diverse and may not reach certain populations. At the same time, technological determinism, which is an assumption that everyone wants to engage in the digital revolution, is also misleading. By creating hashtags and spreading information through these websites like Twitter, those individuals who are not using these websites are excluded and cannot take part in the movement in the same way. Focusing on using social media websites as the main forces in a movement is not sufficient, and it also leads to the devaluing of other non-digital knowledge. For example, if somebody is involved in the movement and shares the same values and aspirations as the activists working on the movement, but is not familiar with the hashtags or trending words or phrases that are being used, that person might be left out or questioned for the lack of engagement. Another notion that is discussed by Jennifer Curlis is the idea of top-down surveillance and lateral social surveillance, which occur while using social media. Lateral surveillance can lead to social pressures and acts of conformity as individual behavior and opinions are made visible to one's network connections. Thus, some people might feel pressured to act and say similar things as their peers or connections in their social media websites like Twitter or Facebook. Top-down state surveillance is a significant issue in the use of these online tools as user information is increasingly harvested by governments and corporations. The awareness of being watched or potentially being watched leads individuals to self-monitor their actions in online forums. While social media platforms has helped learning through social media and the development of movements like It'll No More, there are many limitations to this platform. Especially recently with Trump administration, where people are being required to provide their social media accounts when applying to the United States visa. This does not allow the social media to be a space for free speech and to share democratic ideas among users, and thus for developments of social movements like It'll No More. Since people will be worried that they are being monitored by the state.
In terms of gender, I Don't Know More clearly empowers both indigenous and non-indigenous women, giving them confidence to engage social activism and to stand up against violence towards them. It can also be considered a feminist movement that relates to women's experience from decolonization, and it highlighted the role of women's spiritual duties to the environment, thus allowing them to reclaim their spiritual bond to the Earth Mother. The fight for protection of lands and sovereignty was also a key driving force behind I Don't Know More. Under Bill C-45, the Canadian government introduced the changes of existing legislation governing native lands. In attempts to approve various projects, the government neglected their duties to protect native lands, such as through protecting the navigability of important bodies of water. In response, these unwelcome changes, the First Nations people of Canada utilize medium as a tool to raise awareness and share their voice with the mainstream population. Finally, social media allowed the organizers of I Don't Know More to disseminate their ideas, commitments, and grievances. It also allowed participants to share individual experience and thoughts alongside them, giving a voice to a group of people that has been dispossessed of their power and whose rights and interests were being ignored and infringed upon. Social media, in a sense, become an instrument of democratic reform within the I Don't Know More movement. Thank you for listening to our presentation. The following is a list of references we consulted.